Is from Roslyn, New York. She graduated from Barnard College and Columbia University School of Journalism. She's a sports writer, a feature writer, and of course, author. She was a staff writer at the Washington Post from 1979 to 1988, first in the sports section, covering baseball, tennis, and the Olympics, and then writing for the styles section. And she's written 4 books, a book of fiction called Squeeze Play that was called the best novel ever written about baseball.
Did you order it, Trish?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
You currently cannot get it on Cape Cod.
Soon to be corrected. And it was called that by Entertainment Weekly. She wrote Sandy Koufax, A Lefty's Legacy, in 2002. The Last Boy, Mickey Mantle and the End of America's Childhood. And of course, her most recent, The Big Fella, Babe Ruth and the World He Created. This book was named one of the best books of the year by Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, Newsweek, Amazon, Boston Globe, and many more. It was a finalist for the PEN America Books in the literary sports writing category. And I've loved this book. It's wonderful. Her research is amazing, very painstaking, but it's incorporated very gracefully. And I loved so much hearing about the world, how he fit into the world of his time, and also shaped a large part of the world we live in today. And to continue with Jane, she's also a hot ticket, a great storyteller, and really fun to hang out with. So this book was 8 years in the making, and please join me in welcoming Jane Leavy.
So I think it was my friend Dan, who's there in the back, who said it's great to do these events on your home turf, and really nice to see people you don't know in the audience, not to mention the ones I do know. Thank you guys for showing up and listening to me yet again. I didn't want to write this book. Nobody in their right mind wants to write about Babe Ruth after 75 years after his death, after Bob Creamer, after Marshall Smeltzer, after Tom Meany, after Lee Montville. You Boston Red Sox people know who that is. I was going to write a novel about Babe Ruth. And I had a contract to write a novel about Babe Ruth in which Babe Ruth found out he was black. You laugh. It's not funny, actually. People really believed he was black and that he was passing, that he was 30 years before Jackie Robinson, that he was really the first to reintegrate the major leagues. But life got in the way. And you guys may know this, but fiction pays a hell of a lot less than nonfiction. And so when I went through the divorce, which is as bad as Babe Ruth's parents, as I reported in this book, I decided I should make some money instead of indulging my passion to find out fictionally how Babe Ruth would have felt if somebody had come and said to him, by the way, we have proof that, your mama and daddy were fooling around on the side. So it took 8 years to find a way to write about him that was different from what I intended and from what has been done before. And I decided to do something different tonight because, after all, this is my home court, and I felt like doing something fun and different for you guys. You have not seen these pictures before, and you still haven't seen them when you left this room, because I don't own the rights to half of them. That's why they're not in the book. So some of them I wanted to include, because what I really wanted to do ultimately was give you a different view of who this guy really was. And the best way to do that really was not in words, but in the images that nobody had seen of him before. And so we decided, basically, partly because the alternative was to pay $32,000 for all the pictures I wanted to use, and that was not in the ballpark. We decided to use full page pictures, by and large, so that you could really see what the guy looked like, because his eyes, his mouth, his hands, his everything speak to who he really was in a way that he was either unwilling, unable, or helped by press not to say what he really actually thought or said. So I wanted to start with a picture that nobody's ever seen or nobody's ever published. Dan, you're going to tell me you'd seen this picture, right? Probably, right. Dan would see it.
An experiment here. On or off?
Okay. So I picked this picture for the cover of the book, and there's a secret about this. It's actually inaccurate. HarperCollins, publisher of the book, flipped it. And the real image has him facing the other way. And he's sitting on a bentwood chair in the middle of the infield at the Polo Grounds in 1922. And the reason they flipped it is because, and this is lesson number 1 in publishing 2019, they said, Barnes & Noble and Walmart and all those other Costco type stores said, if you use the image the way it really is, our logo is going to be in the middle of his forehead. So you have a choice. We can buy 50,000 copies of the book, or you can flip the image. And stunningly, the estate of Nicholas Murray, who is the photographer here, agreed. And so they turned the babe backwards. And what I loved about this image particularly is it's rarely seen, except for Dan Okren. Dan Okren would have seen it, because it's so overexposed. But it's wonderful because it's taken by a guy who was not a sports photographer. He wasn't looking to capture the majesty of his swing. He wasn't looking to capture his power. He wasn't trying to get his chin upturned and his big middle waddling down the first baseline. He was trying to actually see the guy. You guys want seats back there, you two? Come on. My kids have actually shown up, which is great. So what he did is he did the thing that made Babe Ruth most uncomfortable. He focused on his face and on his body language. And you can see from that look that Babe Ruth realizes that somebody's actually taken a picture of him. Not his batting form, not his bat, not his stance, not anything. And what attracted me to the picture to begin with, first of all, we had to edit out a bat that was between his legs that looked a little suggestive. But look at the size of his hands. Look at that hand. I was really pissed at the art director because they blotted out so much of his hand with the fella thing. But I wanted you to be able to see just how gigantic his hands really are. And also, I wanted you to see the way he holds himself. This is a guy withholding information. He's trying to make sure that Nicholas Murray, who was a famous fashion photographer, he got famous by photographing Frida Kahlo, with whom he then began a 10-year affair. And he was an Olympic fencer. He was just a fabulous photographer. And this is the only sports image he ever took, except for the famous one of Babe Ruth sitting. There was one sitting, famous one of Babe Ruth with a bat between his legs. He always had a bat between his legs. Go figure. Anyway, I wanted to create an image that you wouldn't forget. Those eyes will follow you. They follow you on, on the book stand. They follow you wherever you go. Those eyes look like they're following you, and those eyes are sad eyes. Everybody thinks about Babe Ruth and the grin and the smile and the wink and the leer. This is the real Babe Ruth. So in 1927, as you all remember, he hit 60 home runs, circling the bases, crowing 60, count 'em 60. Let's see some other son of a bitch do that. And his agent, because among the first things that Babe Ruth did, and did before anyone else in sports, was to hire an agent. And that agent's name was Christy Walsh. He was as tight-lipped and as tight-fisted and as soberly dressed as Babe Ruth was ebullient. They were a perfect pair. And what Christy Walsh did was make Babe Ruth into the first commercial celebrity, the first modern celebrity to take advantage of all the new mechanisms of media and publicity that were just coming into the mainstream in the early 1920s. And so he posed him. And Babe Ruth would pose with anything. I have a picture of him posing with a dead lobster, a 2.9-pound lobster, on National Lobster Day in Boston. That I don't, unfortunately, have to show you. But so here's Babe Ruth getting ready for the home run tour that he's going to take with Lou Gehrig, which starts 2 days after the Yankees beat the Pirates in the 1927 World Series, 4 straight games. And 10 days after he's circled the bases, crowing 60, count 'em 60. And, you know, this guy was made to be a celebrity at a time when the word celebrity was just coming into fashion. He was willing to do anything to make a buck. He was perfectly, totally photogenic, and he was totally craven about money. So what more do you need to be the first real media star of the 20th century? But it was a puzzle to me. Why did he have that personality? When I started out, I read every other book that's been written about him, every biography, autobiography, memoir by every distant cousin that's ever been written. I read virtually all the coverage of him in the New York Daily News and the New York Times, not to mention a lot from hinterlands. But the thing that was most astonishing was that there was absolutely nothing in any of the books about his childhood. It's as if he morphed, Deus Ex Machina, from absolutely nowhere into a Baltimore Orioles uniform in the spring of 1914 to play for Jack Dunn and his minor league Orioles. There is nothing in Creamer. There's nothing in Lee Steinberg. Steinberg, Montville, excuse me. Lee, who is a terrific reporter and writer, actually was so frustrated by trying to find out anything about Babe Ruth's family that he resorted to doing an italicized version of his childhood, his best guess of what happened. And when he couldn't figure stuff out, then he would write, and then the fog rolled in. And the only problem with that is there's really no fog in Baltimore, right, Scott? Yeah, there's no. And what else is wrong with it is that Babe Ruth never lived down by the waterfront, as people have been saying for, these 100 years. Those eyes are the same eyes in that first portrait. And what it says is, what a nice little boy at age 3, but now, wow. And then it's addressed to Herbie and Greta. I think it says Greta. Greta. The reason that this picture is important to me and is so telling is look at the cast of his eyes. That isn't just a miserable 3-year-old in a frilly collar. That is a sad kid whose facial expression is actually much more indicative of who he was and who he would become than all those winking pictures that you're used to seeing. And what's also important about it is, how many people think he was an orphan? You've heard that? How many people think he was an incorrigible, a bad kid who got sent to the orphanage or the reform school because he was acting out and police took him and hauled him off? Neither is true. And nor is it true that his family was poor. Poor families didn't have 3-year-olds sitting for professional photographers in frilly shirts. So that picture told me right off the bat that something about the story, the mythology, was wrong. These are his parents. It's the only known picture of his parents, George and Kate Ruth. George was reputed to be an itinerant guy who couldn't keep a job, who opened and closed saloons all over Baltimore, who had been in the lightning rod business and then gave it up to work on the streetcars. But he was supposed to be broke and a ne'er-do-well, and he couldn't hold a job, and that's why he moved around so much. Kate was already 2.5 months pregnant with Babe when they got married in 1894. And from the beginning, it was not, the distance between them speaks to the denouement of the marriage and also of their relationship. His family was Lutheran, hers was Catholic. He hated the Catholics. So much so that she had to hide, as she had to have little George, as he was known in the family, taken off in the dead of night to be baptized, because if George Sr. knew that his son had been baptized, he would have gone crazy. So you can see that there's not a lot of love lost in that picture, and it would come to no good. On June 13th, 1902, George Sr. took Babe Ruth by the hand and he handed him off to a policeman named Harry C. Birmingham. Harry C. Birmingham was a street cop who patrolled the bars in the western section of Baltimore, and he had been a buddy of George Sr.'s when they were kids. And it so happened that George Sr.'s place, his saloon, was within Harry C. Birmingham's beat. And Harry observed that this was not really a cool place to be raising a 6 or 7-year-old boy who was found playing pool on occasion, emptying the glasses on the saloon table on occasion, taking money out of the till to buy his friends ice cream on occasion. But the myth created by Westbrook Pegler in a newspaper, the first biography of Babe Ruth that was supposed to be actually as told to in the summer of 1922. The myth about Babe Ruth was that his father took him on the streetcar off Lombard Street up to St. Mary's Industrial School, which was on the western cusp of Baltimore City, and looks a lot more cheerful in this rendering than it actually was. It was a dour Victorian granite edifice. It did not have gunmen on the roof, as Al Jolson liked to say. Al Jolson had been there for a couple of years. Yes, they took nice Jewish boys as well as Catholic kids. And it was a state-run or state-sanctioned, city-sanctioned institution for wayward boys, orphan boys, abandoned boys, and incorrigible boys. That was the term of art that was used to describe kids who had gotten in trouble with the law. And everybody knew Babe Ruth was a bad kid, right? Because after all, he had been left to run amok on the waterfront of Baltimore by his poor, hardworking parents who didn't have the time or energy to watch over them. The only problem with that story was, A, George Sr. did not take his son up there. He delegated it to a policeman. And that is the only evidence at all that exists that Babe Ruth was, why Babe Ruth was thought to be an incorrigible, because he showed up at the school with a cop. There is I could find no legal paperwork to say that he had been sent there by the courts. Jack Dunn, the head of the Orioles, who had to sign papers to become legal guardian when he left in 1914, said there was nothing. The fact of the matter is that what happened is Kate and George Ruth divorced. And in 1906, when their marriage imploded, after George found Kate doing what she wasn't supposed to be doing on the, quote, dinging room floor with one of his bartenders, he filed suit for divorce. It was in the papers. It was in the Baltimore Sun. It was in the Baltimore American. This was not a secret in Babe Ruth's childhood. It only became a secret later when he became a public person who did not wish to have this known. So people would say to him, "So Babe, you had no parents, right?" And he would slam his fist down and go, "I had parents." But he never went any further. And when they said he was incorrigible, he would say, "I was a good kid. Just ask the brothers." the Zavarian brothers, who ran this institution for all those kids. Among the other people that that institution accepted were boarding students. Which do you think Babe Ruth was? Yeah, his father paid $15 a month for Babe Ruth to live at St. Mary's. Now again, that belies the mythology that he came from this poor, struggling family that didn't have money to feed him, and that's why they sent him away. In fact, the restaurant and the bar was also a restaurant, and so they were serving food every day, and there was plenty to feed him. What there wasn't, however, was apparently enough nutritional milk, safe and good milk, to feed his brothers and sisters. Because by the time he was sent away to St. Mary's in June 1902, 4 of his siblings had died in infancy, 2 from malnutrition. And when George Ruth was deposed in the divorce suit, which I was able to get the documents for out of the Maryland State Archives, he said, well, she was a good wife when she wasn't drunk, but she was always drunk. She's lousy and the kids are lousy. So as soon as he had her out of the house, which is May 6, 1906, and he was granted custody of the 3 surviving children, Babe's sister Mamie, the only other child from that union who would survive into adulthood, and a little boy named William, who died in a sanitarium outside the city when he was just shy of a year old. The first thing George Sr. did was send his kid away, send the oldest away. Not because he was a bad boy, not because he deserved it, not because he was in trouble with the law, but because he wasn't useful and he was a pain in the neck. Because he was basically just a boy. Anybody have a boy? I have a boy. So at St. Mary's, the kids slept in dorms that were thoroughly unadorned. This picture shows one that isn't as big as some of the others. Many of them wore floors in big buildings that could house maybe 90 kids per floor, and the beds would be head to toe. And you can see there's room between them, just enough for a bent wood chair. There's not a single personal item to be seen. Everything is identical. And these kids lived together, bathed together, slept together, played baseball together. They ate in silence together as the brothers required. And the one thing they had nothing of, they were fed adequately, not great. They were educated adequately, not great. The one thing they had was no privacy whatsoever. So when you start to think about what made Babe Ruth, what gave him the raw material, what experience it was that made him so fitting to be the first great celebrity, the first person to be so public and to thrive on it, the answer is in this room. That's where he learned to be public. What he couldn't be, his daughter told me, his late daughter Julia, what he couldn't be was alone. That was hell for him. And it explains, in fact, why at the end of his baseball career, when Major League Baseball, which it then wasn't called, but when baseball had no place for him, it was such a torment. It was a reversion and a recreation of his childhood, where he was abandoned by baseball just as he had been abandoned by his parents. And there's the boy, there's the babe surrounded by the boys. And that is my favorite picture of Babe Ruth, because that is taken at a moment in his life when he's at an absolute nadir. It's August 1925. Unbeknownst to all those boys, their parents, sports writers, and the rest of the world, he and his then wife Helen had just signed a separation agreement that called for him to pay her $100,000, which was as much as the Yankees paid for him, the Yankees paid to take him off the hands of poor, beleaguered Harry Frazee. But this is him. All you have to do is close your eyes to see him in that other room in the dorm, surrounded by the boys. It's the same guy. He is never more comfortable than he is. He's never more happier in his own skin than he is surrounded by those kids. And the thing that I love particularly about this picture, in addition to just how comfortable he is and how they're draped around him like a cheap boa, is this one poor little kid in the front who's got a beanie on, and his mother's made him wear a tie. And he's the only one looking back at Babe Ruth, because this is a moment in American history when we're first starting to see, yeah, they want to be around Babe Ruth. Yeah, they want to touch him and they want to be close to him in a way that you'll never get close to, let's say, Aaron Judge or Mookie Betts, but they also want to be seen being close to him and being in proximity to him. And there's one little girl on somebody's shoulders back there who it's not me, I swear to God, but she looks just like me. So Christy Walsh was willing to do, and Babe Ruth was willing to follow through on any plan to publicize him and to make him look like a sober American citizen. He had managed to get out of the draft in World War I. Somebody started an FBI investigation when the FBI was brand new, reporting that he was a slacker. And that remained in Babe Ruth's file, and you can still access it today. So one of the first things Christy Walsh, the savvy agent, did was position him, introduce him to General Pershing, and position him as an advocate for any kind of man in uniform. And any opportunity there was to position Babe to be among soldiers or policemen, anytime he got in trouble, there he was in yet another uniform. This is taken in July 1926. And Christy Walsh takes him out to the airport on Long Island, where Charles Lindbergh will take off in the Spirit of St. Louis 10 months later. And he has this Army Air Force guy drop baseballs. And he starts way up high, and Babe's like running around. It's 96 degrees, it's 98% humidity. He's running around in a wool uniform and this baseball glove, trying to catch these balls, and he can't do it. So he comes down to 300 feet where he finally catches a ball. But Christy Walsh, who is a marketing genius, gets this on the front page of the New York Daily News, then the biggest selling paper in New York, and the New York Times, because Babe Ruth has broken the world record for catching a ball dropped from an airplane. Of course, he created the record for him to break. But that didn't bother anybody. There's actually newsreel footage of that. But again, the thing that touches me so much about it, and for a while I wanted to use this as a cover, and they rightly disagreed. It's that wonderful sort of emptiness, and it captures a moment again in his life and in American history where this plane is soaring off in one way. Babe is glued to the ground. His eyes are on the camera. His eyes were always on the camera. But look again how isolated he is. He's just alone there. There are actually barracks behind him, but the propellers kicked up so much dust on this incredibly hot, sweaty day that you can't see them. He went back to the officers' quarters, took a shower, went back to New York, arrived in time for the game at the stadium at 3 o'clock, went 2 for 5 with a triple and a stolen base. So this is young Babe before he became fat, pitching for your Boston Red Sox. Dan, would you like to tell everybody what your famous quote is so I don't screw it up? No, you won't do it?
It's your night, Jay.
No, come on, Dan, help me out. All right. Babe Ruth, this is one of the first pictures taken of him in a Red Sox uniform. It's at spring training. This is when he was known as the Baltimore Blizzard, and he was known for his whistling shooters and you can see the turn of his wrist and how he threw those balls. He was a tall, dark drink of water back then, 6'2", and maybe 190 pounds. And he was, as Dan has said to many people, including me, the reason that Babe Ruth is and always will be the greatest baseball player ever till somebody proves us wrong, and I don't think that's likely to happen, is because he was both Beethoven and Cezanne. He was as great a pitcher in his time as there was. He led the major leagues in innings and wins, and if I look at my notes, I can tell you exactly what those statistics are. Okay, let's see. So he threw 13 1/3 scoreless innings in his first World Series start in 1916, a streak that would continue 2 years later in 1918 World Series against the Cubs, when he threw another 16 1/3 scoreless innings. And that record would last until Whitey Ford of the Yankees broke it with his spitball in 1962. His career ERA, 2.28, is still 16th best of all Major League pitchers. But he was already feeling what he liked to say, what he liked to call hitterish. And so he decided, as Mike Rizzo, the general manager of the Washington Nationals, said, you know, he's already the best left-handed pitcher in the major leagues, and he said, screw it, I'd rather hit. And so he did. And in so doing, he took the game as it had been played out of the hands of micromanaging managers in the dugout, guys like John McGraw, who are accustomed to moving runners around the bases and hit away, a slash and bunt. And Babe Ruth comes along with his 54-ounce bat that he used at least at the beginning, but not for his entire career. And said, why should I do that? Why should I, do this piddle-paddle stuff when I can take one swing and hit the ball out of the ballpark? Well, nobody did that back then. In fact, the statistics about how many home runs were hit back in those days are startling. And let me see if I can find them exactly, because there weren't very many of them. Okay, no one in the major leagues hit more than 12 home runs in 16, 17, or 18. And a person was more likely to know one of the 177 survivors of the sinking of the Titanic than to have seen one of the 235 home runs hit in 1918, 11 of which were hit by Babe Ruth, one of which he surrendered as a pitcher. In 1919, while still in Boston, he hit the unprecedented number of 29 home runs. And by the end of his first season in New York, look at that incredible balance and form. He had completely revolutionized the game of baseball. And the power game that you see today, by and large, is the one that he created. So now everybody wants a part of him. This is Jack Dempsey with Babe Ruth. There are pictures, actually, of the two of them standing right behind each other. You can't tell which one is which. But again, it's something that Christy Walsh created for publicity, and Babe was always game. Here's one of his first ads, again, for a client of Christy Walsh's who wrote a column on automotive tips, which God knows Babe Ruth needed because he wrecked so many cars. And I think that's taken outside the Ansonia. Does anybody recognize that? I think it's the Ansonia, which is where Ruth had an apartment. And that's significant for this reason. When Christy Walsh took on Babe Ruth as a client, or I should say Babe Ruth took on Christy Walsh as his agent, Christy Walsh was an out-of-work sports cartoonist, sports writer, advertising account manager. He'd been fired from so many jobs he couldn't keep track of them, and he was desperate. And he came up with this great idea that what he would do was create a newspaper syndicate where he would sell stories, ghost-written stories, under famous people's names. And at first he wanted to do movie stars, but then he realized, they don't make movies so often. Baseball players play every day. This is a better way to go. Well, he wanted a part of Babe Ruth. Everyone wanted a part of Babe Ruth. and he couldn't get near him because, after all, he was just an out-of-work schlub. So he went to the deli on Broadway, where they supplied Babe Ruth's beer, or so he said in his memoir. And the delivery boy allegedly didn't show up that day, and so Babe Ruth volunteered grandly. Christie offered grandly to take Babe Ruth his beer. And he got up there and allegedly offered him 10 times the amount he'd been getting for his ghostwritten stories, which at the time was $5. So the real story is, and it was told to me by Christie's nephew, that in absolute desperation to reach Babe Ruth before he took off for spring training in February 1921, he climbed a fire escape outside the Ansonia and found out what room he was in, climbed the fire escape, opened the window a crack, let himself in, found the Babe in bed with a blonde, slapped him on the ass and said, "I want to represent you." And this appealed to Babe Ruth. That kind of moxie would have appealed to Babe Ruth, plus the $500 per story. He was the biggest story in the country, if not, in New York, if not the country. And what this picture, again, one that's really, if ever been seen, shows is that the residents of the Upper East Side of Manhattan were so desperate for updates on the pennant deciding series between the Yankees and the Cleveland Indians in September 1921 that they hired a pigeon wrangler, is that what you call it, a wrangler? I don't know, to go to the Polo Grounds with his pigeon, who then flew back and forth from the Polo Grounds to the Upper East Side with updates, because there's no radio, right? The only way you're going to find out is to go down to the candy store at the end of the day, and they didn't want to wait that long. Now, tellingly, the first baseball game broadcast on radio was broadcast just 2 months earlier. And the speed, the revolutionary speed with which technology would change not just baseball, but all of the country, is told very simply. Here you're using pigeons. By 1927, two radio networks, NBC, which was created and went live on January 1st, 1927 at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, and CBS, which came along a couple of months later, broadcast the 1927 World Series coast to coast. It was as revolutionary a moment in technology as the personal computing moment was for us, because the pigeon was quickly retired. Meanwhile, Babe Ruth had to pretend he was a family man. He had married Helen Woodford, a 16-year-old waitress who he met in a coffee shop in Boston in 1914, and married her very quickly. In the year that he left, in the 8 months after he left St. Mary's, as an inexperienced kid who, believe it or not, had never had sex, had never eaten a steak, never ridden a bicycle, never been in an elevator, in the next 8 months, he would sign a contract with the Baltimore Orioles, be sold to the Boston Red Sox, make his major league debut, be sent down to the Providence Grays, help them win their minor league championship, go back up to the Red Sox, and then elope with his sweetheart. And it was, to me, maybe the most touching thing about him. We've all heard, again, in terms of the Babe Ruth mythology, that he was a wild man, a man of such appetite that he couldn't, it couldn't be contained. He didn't know what to do with it, and he was just sort of an animal. In fact, when you look at the language with which he's described, it's actually quite savage and animalistic in a very pejorative kind of way. In fact, the first thing he did as a grown-up was get married. He tried to give himself what he had never had as a child, a family, and the place at the table that Westbrook Pegler described him as leaving, abandoning, when he was sent off to St. Mary's. That the marriage failed, that he didn't know how to be a husband or a father, is hardly surprising. And one might even acknowledge that there are a lot of Major League Baseball players today who do not know how to be husbands and fathers. This was not a pretty chapter in his life. He did not know how to treat women well. Again, for the psychiatrists in this room, knew. What's surprising about that, given his mother? The only thing he ever said about his mother was, "I think she hated me." He did not treat Helen well. He did not treat Dorothy well. In 1923, in Washington, D.C., he met a showgirl named Claire Hodgson. And these are posed pictures arranged by Christy Walsh shortly after they got married, which they did 3 months, just about to the day, after Helen Woodford perished in a truly horrific house fire in Watertown, outside of Boston. She was a looker. She was everything Helen wasn't. She was smart, she was savvy, she was sophisticated, she was gorgeous, and she was willing to put up with his extracurricular activities. And after they were married, he did an astonishing thing. He adopted the daughter, Dorothy, who you saw in that earlier picture, who was introduced to the world as their biological daughter in 1922. So people were a little perplexed, but not so much that they really did any digging about it. This is Julia Stevens, Julia Ruth Stevens, whom he also adopted. So when they married, Claire adopted Dorothy. Babe adopted Dorothy, the girl he said was his biological daughter, and he adopted Julia. And they configured, this would be in 1930, a nuclear family. This is, you can see she's wearing the same dress. So this is when they were cooking. So this was a set of publicity pictures that were sent out on the day the adoption became complete. Why he was adopting a daughter who was allegedly his biological daughter has been a source of mystery for a long time. One of the worst things he did was never tell Dorothy the truth about her parentage. It was rumored and alleged by one of her daughters that she's his biological daughter through a family friend named Juanita Jennings, and much to my amazement, maybe I shouldn't be so amazed, everyone has accepted that as fact without a shred of scientific evidence that it's true. In fact, it's not true. And I've done the DNA testing to prove it. But it's all about who gets to be invited to Cooperstown next year. Julia died in March of this year, and all the jockeying for position is about who's going to be invited to the big prom. That's me and Julia on her 100th birthday. She looks pretty good. This is Babe with a group of fans located, African-American fans, located in the black section, the colored section of a spring training ballpark that the Yankees played in as they barnstormed their way north. And this is one of the pictures that people have seen a lot. I absolutely love it because of the way they're reaching out towards him and because of the way he's so comfortable with it. Again, one of the things that followed him throughout his career were rumors that he was passing. They started at St. Mary's on the playing fields, where he was known by a thoroughly disgusting, you can't call it a nickname, I don't know what you call it, but it's factual, so I'll say it. They called him Nigger Lips. And that term of endearment followed him from St. Mary's, where all you had to do was have big lips and be darkly complected for somebody to conclude, and not know much about your parents, for somebody to conclude that you must be black. So it followed him to Boston, where his teammates called him Tarzan and Nig and all sorts of lovely things, and it followed him to the plate every time an opposing team wanted to get under his skin, which they did routinely, because how are you going to get Babe Ruth out? He's not going to get himself out too often, so you're going to try to annoy him and bench jockey him. And so in 1922, in the 1922 World Series, the last played between the Yankees and the Giants. I don't think this is, that's a different one. I'll get to that in a second. The last one played between the Yankees and the Giants when they were both playing at the Polo Grounds. John McGraw, manager of the Giants, had one of his guys, Johnny Rawlings, a bench player, heckle Babe Ruth from the dugout, and you can imagine what he called him. And they also like to say things like, "Oh, your mother crossed over to the other side," blah, blah, blah. And after the game, and he had a particularly bad series, he had an infected elbow and there were no antibiotics, he did the unthinkable. He went into the opposing locker room. This is, in baseball, this is a violation of major etiquette. And he picks Johnny Rawlings up by the scruff of his neck, and he says, "You can call me a dick and you can call me a cocksucker, just don't get personal." And then he remembers or notices that there are reporters present, one of whom was Frank Graham, a great New York City reporter, sports writer. And he pleads with them, "Please, guys, don't write this." And as was the custom of the time, if Babe Ruth said, "Please don't write it," they didn't write it. Nobody wrote it until Frank Graham wrote an excellent history of the New York Yankees in 1943 and told the story. And he was there to see it. So, and he was a great reporter. And then that was picked up by Bob Creamer in his 74 book, Babe, which was terrific and, really groundbreaking in lots of ways. And it gets coughed up every decade or so that in 2000, Spike Lee wrote his first column as a sports writer for The Gothamist in New York, and his suggestion is, let's dig Babe up. So, and then that becomes a whole to-do, should they dig up Babe? Does it matter if he's black? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It never goes away. His granddaughter, Linda Ruth Tossetti, told me about how she was in a beauty parlor one day, and two lovely African-American people come in, and they look at her, and she introduces herself, and she says she's Babe Ruth's granddaughter. Well, you can't be. You're not black. It's there, and it will follow him forever, despite the fact, and it's in the book, that I did the DNA testing, and there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that he had any African-American heritage. I attribute that both to simple stereotyping by ignorant kids on a playground, and also to the fact that he was so unwilling to talk about his childhood for reasons that had nothing to do with that, but were totally understandable. So this is one of his barnstorming tours. And just like the picture of him with the boys and one girl outside the ballpark in August 1925, this is him at his absolute best. This is at a tubercular camp for kids. And again, this is a picture that I'd never seen before. There they are in their loincloths. And Babe Ruth, who has come from not much, not poverty, but not much. He's wearing his, gabardine coat and his silk tie, and he's got monogrammed shirts, and he's more at home with these kids than he is anywhere else. Look at their smiles. The other place he was at home was with the guys. And the guys, in this case, are fishing columnists in San Diego, because Babe Ruth was so much of a story that in the off season, when he wasn't hitting baseballs, they thought up ways to take him out hunting and fishing so that they had an excuse to write about him. So the guy on the handsome dude, was a sports promoter and salesman in San Diego who showed Babe Ruth where you could get the best bathtub gin in San Diego, and the other two are fishing columnists from San Diego newspapers. Babe said he wanted to catch a Jewfish. They never could get a Jewfish. You can't say the word Jewfish anymore, by the way. It's got a new name. But that was the other place. He was a guy's guy. Whoops. And that's another publicity picture, one that's never seen, of him pretending to be asleep by himself on a beach at the Del Coronado Hotel. And the interesting thing to me about that is his legs weren't that small. They were just smaller than the rest of him. That's it. So all this stuff about him having these skimpy little ankles, not so much. So by 1927, Christy Walsh has got him in movies, he's got him writing newspaper columns, and here he's leaving Hollywood to go home to sign and try to negotiate a deal for the 1927 season with Jacob Rupert. These lovelies were hired gals who were paid to see him off at the station in Los Angeles. Christy Walsh rode with him from Los Angeles to Utah, trying to teach him how to negotiate a contract for himself. He had been laying the groundwork, trying to persuade people that Babe Ruth was worth $150,000 a year by dropping little bun mo to all the columnists he knew, hoping that when Babe Ruth actually got to negotiate with Jake Rupert, he would come away with $100,000. And they actually did play acting, and Christy Walsh would say, well, now I'm Jake, and you say to me, yeah, but I know nobody's made $100,000 in baseball, but look how many people I've put in the seats. This was, he wasn't allowed to attend the negotiations. Agents weren't allowed to participate in negotiations when Roger Maris broke the record in 1962. But here's Christy Walsh trying to teach him how to exert leverage. He failed to apply the lessons. He came away with a 3-year deal for $70,000 a year, which of course was unprecedented, but not nearly as much as he deserved. And this is the swing. He said, I swing big with everything I've got. I hit big or I miss big. Mostly, he didn't miss. He led the Yankees to the 4-game sweep of the 27 World Series and the 28 World Series. And that swing, which is actually, he was actually quite articulate. For somebody who had words put in his mouth most of the time, he was actually quite articulate and able to describe the movement of his body in space and what it is that he did to create leverage and torque with a big power swing. And it's stunningly modern in all the ways that you see today. I mean, they're basically doing the same thing. So there's Christy in his inevitable double-breasted suit, and Lou Gehrig, because this is the publicity picture that he created at Yankee Stadium before they went out on their tour, their 3-week barnstorming tour across America. Walsh called it a symphony of SWAT, and it took them to 21 cities in 9 states, and they traveled 8,000 miles, played before 220,000 people. How he actually counted that, nobody knows, and I am not at all sure it's true, and signed allegedly 5,000 baseballs. What you do know that's true, because I found Christy Walsh's accounting statements that he provided Babe Ruth at the end of their professional relationship, was that Babe Ruth earned $30,000 in those 3 weeks, which in 1927 dollars is a fair chunk of change. He also earned $3,000 in Kansas City for posing in what was then called the Wisit, felicitously known as the workwear known as the Wizard. It was the first time a zipper was used in men's clothing. And then that advertisement appeared in Collier's and Liberty magazine, so that there were a lot of those side deals that Babe did on his own. This is Babe and Lady Babe, the layingest rooster in America, posing in Omaha in front of the hen house, felicitously. And again, this is an example of what today we call synergy, but we didn't have a word for it then. This is just being invented. The idea that the contest and the owners of this silly bird can profit off of Babe Ruth's fame by renaming Lady Norfolk Lady Babe, which is how she became known throughout the country. So this is fun, and this should take just a second here. Nebraska chicken farming was not so big until Lady Norfolk came along. It did not do nearly as well as those chickens in Missouri and other states, but they had the champion of 1927. Two champions. That picture appeared in 300 newspapers around the country. And there's the hidden egg trick. And there's the smile that you're used to seeing from him. He was really up for anything. So then they go on to Sioux City, where he poses with the children of the promoter of the game, and Jiggs Donahue, and the unfortunate pony, Molly, who you will see has a problem very quickly. So this is the playful Babe. That poor horse did not last much longer. You can almost see her like going off to the left. And Lou Gehrig comes and stands behind her rear flank in order to make sure the poor thing doesn't keel over. She died a year later. And that's Babe Ruth. I hired a lip reader to do this, saying to the lip reader, to the cameraman, turn that fucking thing off. Sorry, I know there's a child here. I apologize. This is the greeting in Denver, where they were dubbed Little Chief and Big Chief, and they had headdresses. And this is him with a young man named Jack Whitey Stewart in San Francisco. Jack was the bat boy for the San Francisco Seals. Look at his hands. They're like garden trowels. And anytime you want to know how, cultivators is what I mean. Anytime you want to know how he did what he did, when people ask me, how did Sandy Koufax do what he did? You know, and I would ask that question to pitching coaches and batters. They say, have you shaken hands with him? And I said, no. And they said, well, you shake his hand and then come back. Well, his hand reaches up to here on me. I mean, I'm small, but still. Babe Ruth's hands were bigger. In fact, at the Hall of Fame, they have his bowling balls behind glass, and Cal Ripken was there, and I've known Cal Ripken since he was Rookie of the Year, and he comes up to me and he grabs my shirt and he says, come here, I gotta show you something. And he drags me over to see Babe Ruth's bowling ball, and he says, I really want to stick my fingers in Babe's ball. And, you know, that's Cal. I said, yes, Cal, I think we can arrange that. And in fact, there's another ball, a homelier ball, down in the basement of the Hall of Fame, and I went to get it so that Cal could stick his fingers in the ball. Now, it was not entirely a frivolous comment. What he wanted, Cal said, was to feel the spread of his fingers. He wanted to be able to understand how he could both control a bat the way he did and a baseball the way he did. And So Cal had to go off and make an appearance. So I got a bowling ball expert to come and measure Babe's balls for Cal. And everybody hold up your thumb, okay? All right. So the distance between the middle knuckle on Babe's hand and the middle finger is about 4.5 inches. That's not so awesome. Between this finger and this finger, about 4.25 inches. Again, it's big, but it's not unprecedented. The spread was about 10 inches. Again, not so big for a modern guy. However, the width of the bowling ball holes custom drilled for Babe Ruth at the knuckle of the thumb is 1 3/32 inches wide. That's approximately the size of an unshelled walnut. That's how big his hands were. That's how he controlled a bat. That's why his hand comes all the way around Jack the way it does. And Jack had an okay life, not a great life, but when he was buried, he stipulated to his children that he wanted to be buried with the jersey that he was wearing the day he was Babe Ruth's bat boy. And so it was an open coffin, and everybody looked in and went, there he is with his Seals jersey. And it was in memory of what he said was the best day of his life. Okay, this is a piece of film also from the barnstorming tour, and it was a mystery where it was taken until just recently. That's Lou Gehrig, in case you want to get a sense of how gigantic he really was. And Tom Schieber, the Hall of Fame, and I collaborated to figure out where it was taken. It's actually Stockton, California. And what's significant about it is, you'll see in a second, Babe Ruth takes a swing that he hurts his back on. By this point, he had blisters on his hands that were bleeding and cracking, and they've been, there he goes, reaching for his back. So the next day, they decided to add a game in Marysville, California, another 2 hours north, in order for him to see the chiropractor that the Pacific Coast League players swore by. So they went all the way to Marysville to see that guy who later claimed that he could have cured Babe Ruth's cancer. This is them arriving in Fresno with a local priest. At every stop, there would be a priest. A lot of times, the organizers were the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic organization that Babe Ruth belonged to. And here's the final thing. Babe Ruth promised Lou Gehrig a trip, a hunting and fishing trip at the end. Their last game was rained out in Long Beach, California, and so they went hunting and fishing with one of the many rich men who liked to treat Babe Ruth to a good time. I don't think Gehrig had ever been in waders or ever shot a gun before. And there's Babe Ruth passed out, dead drunk, in a duck blind. Causing the rich guy who funded the expedition to say, I spent the second night in Gehrig's blind. I didn't want to be with Babe Ruth, dead drunk, with a shotgun. There are just three more pictures. This is 3 weeks after he retired from baseball in June 1935. Dressed up as a member of the Swiss Admiralty and Navy at a celebrity game at a Westchester country club. That's all there was for Babe Ruth to do. That's the last appearance with Gehrig, the day that Gehrig announced his retirement and gave the famous luckiest man speech. And that's Babe Ruth on his last Christmas with kids who were suffering from polio, one of whom asked him if he could arrange for a baby brother. And Babe, in his old days, certainly would have had some kind of ribald and quick rejoinder. In this case, he just looked around and said, "Help me." And it's on radio, so and it was taped, so you can. This is his last birthday his 53rd birthday, taken in Miami with 2 little boys he didn't know. And that is the farewell from Yankee Stadium, June 13th, 1948. And the building in the corner behind the stand, the one you can just see the windows, that's where my grandmother lived. Which explains why I've been doing this for as long as I have. It's not the famous picture Nat Fine took from the rear showing the famous number 3 as he came out of the visitors' dugout for one last visit to the mound to say farewell, but it shows that it was still his place, and I kind of prefer it. Thank you.